Hello everyone, I'm back and I decided to make good on my promise a while ago of making a comprehensive reading guide for mutualism, for people that are just getting into the ideology or think they have a pretty good grasp on it either from watching my earlier video or from some other source and are looking to test that assumption. I'm going to upload some mirrors of important left anarchist theory videos from current YouTubers, and maybe also some ANCAP theory videos around the time this is published. However, those videos will be for beginners to anarchism. This video is designed for the same audience that my previous hour-long video in Introduction to Mutualism was designed for, that being experienced and well-read ANCAPs or ANCOMs. This is going to be very comprehensive, but I definitely rank this in order of most important to least important texts to make it easier to digest. Starting off with the most critically important core mutualist writings, and then moving on to some earlier theorists whose work highly influenced those particular texts, and finally in a third tier below that, some works which I think are particularly illuminating from a anarcho-communist economic perspective and a ANCAP and broader right libertarian economic perspective in order for people to shore up their understanding of those particular more major schools of anarchism as well. As modern mutualism undeniably draws and builds upon both ANCOM and ANCAP theoretical understandings for its viewpoints. You'll notice fairly quickly that unlike with a lot of recommended reading lists for anarchist theory that can skew towards very, very old books, my mutualist reading list is primarily made up of 21st century and some late 20th century works. I've always believed that it's very important to prioritize more modern works, given the difficulties a lot of people have with archaic language, as well as a lot of references to irrelevant cultural practices or technologically obsolete modes of living. Many mutualists listening in will probably be pretty shocked by my fairly low opinion of the utility of most of the 19th and early 20th century mutualist texts commonly circulated among the community today. One of the important things that I didn't end up covering in my Introduction to Mutualism video so much was that this community of people that is around and that I am a part of, that believe in the idea of workers' self-managed businesses and self-employed individuals within a free market under an anarchist system of direct democratic organization, we call ourselves by a myriad of different names, and I really think that this is actually an unfortunate state of affairs, and leads to a lot of confusion on the part of outsiders. Mutualism is the original name for this ideology, coined by Proudhon, of course, but as the 19th century progressed, the term individualist anarchism emerged, and it really has two separate, in my view, mutually exclusive definitions, which can lead to a lot of confusion. One definition of individualist anarchism that you'll find in anarchist spaces is basically a name for the specifically American mutualists of the mid to late 19th century, the most prominent of these being Benjamin Tucker, who I figure is probably the person whose name I dropped the most in the earlier video, apart from Kevin Carson, who is primarily influenced by Tucker. But another definition of individualist anarchism is regarding a form of anarcho-communism, counterintuitively, that simply stressed a more individualistic philosophical approach to the ideology, without any significant differences in fundamental beliefs about political and economic organization to the mainstream of anarcho-communism. The most prominent subgroup of this faction of individualist anarchism is egoist anarchism, often simply just egoism. Again, this is really just anarcho-communism with a more individualistic philosophical underpinning. Naturally, people like Max Stirner didn't focus too much on advocating for anarcho-communist economics, really, because that wouldn't have made him stand out. He mostly was a writer on moral philosophy, but it's clear from many of his writings that he did actually believe in anarcho-communism. Another example of one of these individualistic anarcho-communist anarchists is Renzo Novatore. Naturally, one of the most important talking points for these 19th century individualist anarcho-communists is the necessity to be continually vigilant and watchful that the direct democratic assemblies should not tyrannize over the minority and lead to mob rule, but they never actually advocated for any genuine alternative to the direct democratic assembly model that the majority of ANCOMS hold to. Of course, one can point out that all ANCOMS, and Mutualists as well, recognize the critical importance of having structures in place for minorities to voice their dissent, up to and including leaving the community or creating a seceded territory. Even the ANCAPS sometimes claim the individualist anarchist label, although they mostly leave it to leftists like Mutualists and the particular group of ANCOMs that I just mentioned. So far, we have one other term, individualist anarchism, that is sometimes used to refer to economic and social positions identical to mutualism, and sometimes not. But then we have the term left libertarian, which really took off as a descriptor in the community of people advocating for worker self-management and self-employment in an anarchistic free market in the 21st century. And this one is really commonly found as a term for our community. Just as a heads up, most of the works that I'm recommending here prefer to use that term, left libertarian, for the community which I am a part of. However, despite this term is actually quite a lot worse, because it could be taken in at least 4 different directions. You could be talking about that particular community of people advocating for workers' self-management and self-employment in an anarchistic free market, or you could be talking about that group and also ANCOMs taken as an umbrella term, because, well, they are also libertarians on the left. You could be talking about ANCAPS and minarchist capitalists that happen to hold left-wing social views, that support drug legalization and the gay community, which is, most of them, I will remind you. Then what do you do about libertarian Marxists like Luxemburgists or followers of people like Anton Pannekoek or Cornelius Castoriadis? It's just too broad and confusing of a term, left libertarian. I even occasionally hear ordinary American liberals refer to themselves as left libertarians, which to them I think just means you're a liberal or a center-left person that cares a lot about the police state and the NSA and censorship, and, probably influenced by the usage of the term civil libertarian in U.S. discourse. Perhaps it could also mean, on top of that, someone who is more open to the idea of criticizing certain unreasonable government economic regulations while still being in favor of the existence of a strong welfare state and centralized government. And finally, there is one more commonly used term that you'll come across, alongside mutualist, individualist anarchist, and left libertarian, left-wing market anarchist. You'll certainly come across this as you go through the reading list, which is just as fuzzy, again, because it could refer to my particular ideological grouping. It could, yet again, very easily also refer to ANCAPs, who happen to have left-wing social views. I have no idea why there are so many terms for the same ideas, but it's not entirely unexpected. After all, smaller political organizations and smaller ideologies tend to have a lot more infighting and excessive fixation on small differences of belief or strategy, since everyone is trying to get their ideas across in this small, slowly growing group, and push their ideas and viewpoints to more prominence while they still can. And larger ideologies, in comparison, have had time to develop more of a consensus on basic tenets and viewpoints. But I've always been in favor of trying to get my community to agree on one term, and so far I think that mutualism would probably be the most workable term to use, because of the fact that it is very distinct and unique sounding, and can't be inadvertently confused for a quirky form of anarcho-communism, or a quirky form of anarcho-capitalism, or a quirky form of social democracy, or what have you. I mean, unless you're worried about people getting confused about the biological concept of mutualism. But just so I don't come off as overly stubborn, I will admit that I rather do like the terms free market anti-capitalist or anarchist market socialist, but just for the sake of clarity, we'll stick with mutualist for the rest of this video. But again, to reiterate, you can be completely assured when it comes to the terms on your screen right now, within the context of the writings referenced in this video specifically, despite certain works that might use alternative definitions for these 4 terms, every single one of them refers to the exact same thing. Again, an anarchist ideology in favor of worker co-ops and self-employed people competing on a free market, with a political structure consisting of direct democratic assemblies. And given that this is the case, that they all do mean the same thing for the purposes of this video, given that I've chosen to do that, I've elected to just pick one of these terms and use it continually throughout the video for ease of understanding. But if you, having been exposed to these texts that use different terms for this single ideology, mutualist, individualist anarchist, left libertarian, and you decide that you prefer one of the other terms on the screen because you like the sound of it more or you think it fits you better, go right ahead. Just remember, when it comes to the actual content, they all mean the same thing. Alright, now that we've pissed everybody off, let's get started. Most of these texts are available legally for free online on sites like the Anarchist Library or the author's own website, due to the traditional opposition of anarchists to intellectual property laws, particularly the mutualist community, and I'll note on the screen which texts are and aren't available for free. That's not to say that you couldn't go on illegal websites to find these works, just that certain texts here are sanctioned as officially non-copyrighted, and some aren't. If you haven't been on the Anarchist Library yet, I personally don't care for their font size, but you are able to download PDFs of basically every Anarchist Library text, and it really has, great font, great formatting, that kind of thing, so that's an option as well. I wish I could say that I've read every single text that I recommend here from start to finish, but unfortunately that's not really true. But I have read the majority of them and skimmed all of them, and I certainly understand the main ideas and why they're important enough to make it on this list. So, for part 1, you're going to start off with really the inaugural text of the mutualist revival of the 21st century, Kevin Carson's essay, The Iron Fist Behind the Invisible Hand, which introduces a lot of mutualist arguments with a particular focus on the development of modern capitalism, looking at the history of England and America in the 18th and 17th centuries. The next critical body of work is a collection of articles hosted on the website for the mutualist organization Alliance of the Libertarian Left, which was a continuation of a short-lived organization named Movement of the Libertarian Left, started in the 90s by the heterodox ANCAPS thinker Samuel Conger. The ALL had a pretty important impact on the tremendous explosion of interest in mutualism in the late 2000s and early 2010s, which was when I came of age politically, but unfortunately it's sort of died down these days. There are a lot of dead blog links here, but most of the blogs of the most prominent 21st century mutualist thinkers are still active. Sheldon Richman's blog, Roderick Long is still writing, Gary Chartier is still active on Facebook at least, but his blog is no longer being updated. Carson's blog was fully deactivated up until not too long ago, actually, when he brought it back online for people to look back on. After a certain point, though, all of the zeal and enthusiasm that infused the various minor blogs and forums dedicated to propagating mutualist ideas were all kind of shuttered one at a time, until all of the major writers at that time came to gather around a single focal point online, a newly formed online group under the name Center for a Stateless Society. Almost all online mutualist activity for the past 10 years or so has been on this one site, and while there's plenty of interesting stuff to explore, it is a shame that despite the period of frenetic activity and rapid growth of the movement between roughly 2006 and 2012, there just aren't enough mutualists nonetheless to support the growth of more than one website, or at least that's what most of the people in the community seem to believe. As for the older blogs, there was definitely some cool stuff on Kevin Carson's blog, named simply Mutualist Blog, back before 2014 when he stopped updating it, but it was, as you might expect from a blog, pretty haphazard, and I didn't really keep up with it religiously. I don't think any of the various ALL Facebook pages post anymore either, and the forums of the Libertarian Left that I used to frequent in high school is also gone, but the collection of articles on the right-hand side of the main ALL webpage here is absolutely fantastic, and is probably the single best collection of information on mutualism on the entire internet. There are a few dead links, though, which is why I've taken the liberty, pun intended, of compiling all of the articles into one PDF document for you all. But yeah, I highly recommend you do read all of the articles. The links in italics in the middle and bottom of the list here on the screen are to full-length books, and naturally I think you should hold off on those until later when I discuss which are worth reading. But you don't have to go on the ELL website, you just have to go to the description of this video to the Google Drive links to the Alliance of the Libertarian Left anthology. Once you've gone through those articles, there are a few rarer essays that aren't on the Alliance of the Libertarian Left website that are nonetheless very prescient and interesting. First off, I think you should read Keith Preston's review of The Iron Fist Behind the Invisible Hand for a different perspective and some important addendums to the topics covered in Kevin's essay, and Keith's other article, Free Enterprise, An Antidote to Corporate Plutocracy, which is a further expansion on Iron Fist. Then there's Kevin Carson's A Political Program for Anarchists, which is also in the ALL anthology, but if you ended up skipping over it while reading through that document, I definitely recommend you go back and read it, as it is a fantastic introduction to mutualist and just generally anarchist political strategy, a topic which will be covered in more depth near the end of this video, and Reparations, Cui Bono by Carson, Gary Elkin's essay Mutual Banking, as well as Sane Anarchy by Larry Gambone. Now that you've had a thorough grounding in the basics through these various essays, you're ready to take on longer texts. For Part 2, you'll be looking at Kevin Carson's most famous full-length book, Studies in Mutualist Political Economy, published in 2007. Chapters 1 through 3 are a very dense and complicated rundown of the labor theory and subjective theories of value and mutualist responses to both, and while it is important to understand these concepts in order to mount a full defense of mutualism against other forms of socialism as well as against capitalism, Kevin understood that most people reading that section would have a thorough grounding in older non-mutualist economic works. So I would skip those chapters for now, and go straight to reading chapters 4, 5, and 9, alongside the introduction to Part 2, which offer much more digestible arguments against the current system and possible mutualist alternatives, much of which I've summarized in my earlier video. In many ways, these chapters are expansions on arguments advanced in Iron Fist and A Political Program for Anarchists. Chapters 6, 7, and 8, however, are a bit removed from the practical focus of most of the book, and I would say are only worth reading if you're already interested in the various topics covered in those chapters, so I'll put them as optional and you can skim through them to see if you're interested. There are going to be a lot of essays and books here that are important enough here to mention, yet not quite important enough to be essential reading. Part 3. In order to fully understand how the arguments in favor of capitalism, as well as more mainstream Marxist-oriented socialism, took shape in the 19th and 20th centuries, you'll have to actually go back and read the primary sources, and by primary sources, I mean Marx and Engels and Adam Smith. Read Smith first if you haven't already. He's easier to understand, and it's also easier to see parallels between the way he saw the world and the way mutualists do. I even included him as a sort of pseudo-mutualist unsung hero in my earlier video. Someone should really write a book about the many stark differences between Smith's worldview and the worldview of modern-day apologists for capitalism. The relevant work of his here is, of course, The Wealth of Nations. As for Marx and Engels, plenty of you may have already read the Communist Manifesto, but a lot of people recommend instead to read another short book, Wage, Labor, and Capital, as a gentle introduction to fundamentals of Marxist economics. Of course, I'm a mutualist, not a Marxist. There are significant differences in our worldview and particularly in our proposed solutions, but reading Marx and Engels is still incredibly important to fully get a handle on how anti-capitalists in general, not just my particular brand of anti-capitalist, have come to see our current system, and it's particularly in response to the Marxist point of view that supporters of capitalism have formulated their counter-arguments. Once you've read Wage, Labor, and Capital, you may or may not be ready to tackle Das Kapital, really just Capital. It's long, so take your time. I recommend Harry Cleaver's study guide to Capital, covering the text chapter by chapter, to help you through the main ideas, and I think personally you can skip Volume 2 and just go through Volumes 1 and 3. Cleaver presents the chapters of Capital purposefully out of order, for ease of understanding. He begins, as Carson does, with the history of the development of capitalism in the 18th and 19th centuries. I would then recommend Googling an explanation of the subjective theory of value, the capitalist alternative theory to the labor theory of value from 19th century socialism, from the perspective of the Austrian school, the Austrian school being the economic foundation of modern-day right libertarian capitalist theory. It's called the Austrian school because it originated with Austrian academics in the 19th century, such as Karl Menger and the economist Eugen von Bombaverk, who truly must have the silliest name I have ever heard. But it's the 20th century Austrian and American members of the movement that have had more influence these days, however, such as Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, and Murray Rothbard, the inventor of anarcho-capitalism. I can't imagine most people would want to read another dense tome of economics after Capital, which is why I recommend just looking up a summary of the subjective theory of value in lieu of a full book, but if you really want to punish yourself, you can go back to the original texts. Perhaps Socialism by Ludwig von Mises from 1922, or even Eugen von Bombaverk's Capital and Interest and Karl Marx and the Close of His System. If you find you've really enjoyed works such as Capital from the classic period of what was called back then political economy, a term used for the fields of economics and political philosophy taken as a whole, the other most important works by Marx and Engels, as I've come to understand them, after Capital and Wage, Labor, and Capital, would probably be divided into two tiers of importance. In the first tier, we have a work that was meant to be a companion to Wage, Labor, and Capital, that being Value, Price, and Profit, a contribution to the critique of political economy from 1859, which had a decent influence on studies in mutualist political economy. Carson particularly recommends picking up an edition that has the introduction by the English economist Maurice Dobb, and the very underrated Principles of Communism from Engels, and the first part of the German ideology, and then in a second tier down, we have a number of works, such as the Critique of the Gotha Program, the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844, the Grundrisse, Marx's Critique of Proudhon in the Poverty of Philosophy, and Engels's Anti-Düring from 1877. You may also be interested in checking out the often overlooked but incredibly influential works of the third member of the famous triumvirate of old school economics, David Ricardo, the main work here being On the Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. Have I read all of these books? Well, of course I have. Of course. Come on, how could you think any different? I mean, really. Now armed with a full understanding of both the labor theory of value and the subjective theory of value, you're finally ready to dive into the chapters of Kevin Carson's Studies in Mutualist Political Economy that deal with that topic. Take some time to fully absorb the arguments, just as you did with the subjective theory of value and with Smith and Marx, before you move on to part 5 of this video. Next up, we have another anthology. This one was released around the tail end of the modern mutualist revival, and I think was meant to be an updated, fresh take on the collection of articles presented on the Alliance of the Libertarian Left website. It was edited by, among others, Charles Johnson and Gary Chartier, two critical mutualist thinkers, who I'm sure you have been adequately familiarized with in Part 1. This widely read anthology was entitled Markets Not Capitalism, and was released in 2011. There's some overlap between the articles in the first anthology in the description of this video and this one, as I mentioned in the introduction that I wrote for my ALL anthology document, but there's enough new stuff here to be worth looking into. One of the reasons why I prefer the ALL anthology over this one, though, and why I'm suggesting to read it first, is that I think the editors of Markets Not Capitalism tried a bit too hard to include relative short essays from older writers, like the American Voltaire and de Cleyre, that just don't have the same relevance and poignancy as the modern stuff. But still, I do think this anthology is worth checking out. Now comes something a little different. I'm going to divide the reading list based off of whether you, listening to this, are an ANCOM or an ANCAP, because I think it's pretty important for ANCAPs to be aware of how the political and economic organization of anarcho-communism works, and vice versa for ANCOMs with ANCAP social organization. Mutualists, as I mentioned in my earlier video, have identical visions of our ideal structures for political decision-making, justice, and law to ANCOMs, but we differ on economics. and the work I'm going to recommend will give you a firm understanding of both the ways in which mutualists differ from ANCOMS and where we agree. I know that it's probably a tall order to expect ANCOMS to open their minds to the positive aspects of anarcho-capitalist ideas, and the same vice versa, but I hope that a look through these next fundamental texts will provide enough of a framework to see the other side through a new light, and contribute to bottom unity, which is really just as important to me as promoting mutualism specifically, if not more so. So, if you're an anarcho-capitalist, I'm going to direct you to a very peculiar work that you may or may not have heard of. It's called an Anarchist FAQ. It's an absolutely enormous project at around 4,000 pages or so, and it's still being edited and updated every so often, with the first chapters being written in 1995, although the length of the text has stayed relatively stable for at least 10 years now, I think, if not longer. Obviously, most people haven't read the whole thing, although honestly by now I probably have, in bits and pieces over the years. This is really a work where you can pick it up and read from any point in the text rather than reading from front to back. An Anarchist FAQ was the first work on anarchism I ever read, and it converted me instantaneously. It's really fantastic, and something I just keep coming back to again and again. If there was some sort of collapse of society and only one work of anarchist theory survived, I would want it to be this one. I recommend ANCAPS to start out with sections A and B, which introduce the philosophical underpinnings of left-wing anarchism before getting into too much detail about proposed systems of political organization and decision-making or economic organization. Here you'll find information on how we think about and define hierarchy and authority, what we think are the harmful psychological after-effects of those things, and a brief sketch of why we like direct democracy so much. Sections A and B add up together to about 440 pages, but if you're an ANCAP that thinks they have a pretty good handle on left anarchist thought already, you might be able to get away with skipping to the third section that I recommend you read, which in my view is by far the most important. Section I. Section I is an extremely thorough and meticulous undertaking, explaining both the political structures of left-wing anarchism and the economic foundations, and you should still read it even if you don't read sections A and B, because no matter how much you think you know about left anarchist theory, it can't hold a candle to the denseness of this piece of work. It really is more detailed than anything else on exactly what we want the world to look like. Mutualism has always been a minority community within the broader left anarchist umbrella in comparison to anarcho-communism, so naturally an anarchist FAQ makes no bones in explicitly stating the fact that it's written from an ANCOM perspective rather than a mutualist one. So, of course, the FAQ's editorial collective prefers the ANCOM method of economic organization to mutualism, but the important thing for you to know as an ANCAP reading this is that you can still be completely assured that Section I-5, which details the functioning of left anarchist direct democratic assemblies, is identical to the positions held by mutualists. It's only in other sections, like I-4, which details the author's ideal economic system, that more explicitly ANCOM ideas are put forth. Sections I-1 through I-3, in contrast, try to offer up a balanced viewpoint between ANCOM and mutualist perspectives, and the perspective of Bakunin's collectivist anarchism, on topics such as how worker cooperatives would organize in federations to share information, and how it might be possible for people who were once simple employees to gain the skills and knowledge necessary to manage worker co-ops as equals. If you're interested in delving into other sections of the FAQ, Section H is a fantastic intellectual takedown of authoritarian socialism, with virtually no argument ever leveled by Marxists against anarchists in the entire history of the movement left unaddressed. The first two of the Anarchist FAQ's 4 long appendices concern authoritarian socialism, and the second is the far more interesting of the two. The first one is just like a general grab bag of comments from Marxist writers over the years, and the second one is a deep dive into more uncomfortable truths about the Russian Revolution and how the Leninist ideology betrayed genuine freedom and democracy in that country, as well as a very useful month-by-month account of the actions of Nestor Makhno's revolutionary insurgent army of the Ukraine and its free territory, which controlled a significant portion of eastern Ukraine during the upheaval of the Russian Civil War. You could also take a look at the newer anarchist YouTuber Anarch's video series, The State is Counter-Revolutionary, for similar arguments. There are some weird sections and weak spots for sure. It seems that Ian MacKay, the British anarchist who is the single largest contributor to the FAQ, had a peculiar, unique interest in the theories of Wilhelm Reich, a thinker part of the early generation of psychologists around the time of such people as Freud, Carl Jung, Erich Fromm, and so forth, who had some rather out there ideas about the importance of promoting human sexual liberation as the single most important factor in dealing with mental illness. And the authors of the FAQ just kind of shoehorn Reich's theories in there without necessarily making it clear that most anarchists probably don't even know who Wilhelm Reich is, let alone subscribe to his theories. I might like Reich, but he's not universally loved among left anarchists for sure. The worst section by a mile is the section on anarcho-capitalism, section F, which just completely slanders and strawmans the entire ideology and follows a tiresome, predictable pattern of accusing ANCAPS of being closet feudalists or fascists or both, with another similar appendix added later being not quite as vitriolic but still filled with a lot of distortions and unwillingness to even acknowledge what the ANCAPS arguments even are in terms of how they believe possible abuses by private police and courts would actually be curtailed. Sections C, D, and E contain a lot of arguments against mainstream capitalist economics, conversely that I think end up being just too stretched thin and scattered, considering the enormous amount of topics that could fall under that umbrella of critiquing mainstream assumptions. And so I think the particular topics these sections cover just come across as kind of arbitrarily chosen, in my view. So while in comparison to the ANCAP sections, there's not a lot that I would say is outright bad in these three sections, but I still wouldn't recommend them. All in all, though, the Anarchist FAQ is truly fantastic. I've read basically all of the major works that a lot of left anarchists recommend as being a good grounded explanation of the functioning of a future anarcho-socialist society. I've read Alexander Berkman's ABCs of Anarchism, I've read Emma Goldman's Anarchism and Other Essays. While both Bakunin and Kropotkin, I would say, are better writers than either of those two, still, nevertheless, Bakunin doesn't really touch on economics in most of his major works, and Kropotkin, while he does clearly focus on economics a lot, he doesn't really have any works that I'm aware of, at least, that go into the detail that I think is necessary to explain the functioning of the direct democratic assemblies, as opposed to the functioning of a moneyless communist economy. An Anarchist FAQ is really the best practical book-length work on anarchism that I've come across so far that touches on both these topics with equal competence. Although when I started writing this, I hadn't quite yet realized just how good Daniel Berrien or Anarch's YouTube channel is for that kind of thing, particularly his videos Power and After the Revolution, so I've mirrored those videos on my channel. If you're wondering, there is actually an entire section dedicated to explaining mutualism, section G, and it's not terrible, but not amazing either, given its clear ideological basis in anarcho-communist viewpoints, and the fact that it was mostly written before the period of greater mutualist activity online in the late 2000s and early 2010s. I think you're much better off learning about mutualism from actual mutualist writings instead. I do, however, have to give credit to the writers of this section for having a generally conciliatory and warm tone towards mutualists and their ideas, even if we ultimately disagree, which I think is reflected in relations between ANCOMS and mutualists as a whole. Even if ANCOMS often misunderstand what we're about, the two communities do still tend to get along fairly well, and that's a good thing. But don't think I'm letting you off that easy, ANCOMS. Now it's your turn to open your mind to new ideas. That's right, I'm going to assign you some ANCAP literature. You're going to read For a New Liberty by Murray Rothbard and The Machinery of Freedom by David Friedman. Machinery of Freedom is a little more haphazard than For a New Liberty and has a bit more of a grounding in specific policy concerns of earlier times, but nonetheless it is a little better than For a New Liberty. It's more straightforward and avoids some of that libertarian preaching/ideologue mindset that's common to a lot of right libertarian writing, unfortunately, and because it takes a more consequentialist utilitarian ethical viewpoint, which I am more sympathetic to in general, although I think that most intelligent people, educated about philosophy, will tend to use a bit of both deontological and consequentialist arguments and empiricist arguments for different purposes. But I still do recommend reading For a New Liberty first, even though it is not as good as Machinery, as it does cover some basic theoretical grounding in right libertarian theory generally, before getting into the specifically anarcho-capitalist stuff. If you're looking for more, there's always Stefan Molyneux's surprisingly overlooked short work Practical Anarchy, which explores some slightly different solutions to the problems of today than the other two works, including an approach to law and justice that seems to be entirely focused around social and economic ostracism, in place of any use of prisons or penal colonies of any sort, seemingly like cutting off people's water and electricity if they commit a crime, which to me seems even more cruel than a prison, which that might just be me, but his justification is that he's really interested in focusing on the idea of not initiating force, ever, and trying to work out how we can deter criminals and mete out punishments without actually physically restraining anybody, which seems a little naive to me. There's also the YouTube video Law Without Government by the ANCAP YouTuber Man Against the State, which is really good and mostly based off of consequentialist arguments, and I'll upload as a mirror to my channel. Just to be fully transparent though, the version of that video that I'm going to upload is a version that I edited myself, which I think combines the best elements of the original three-part series from 2011 and the remake from 2020. But I'll leave links to both versions in the description of my mirror. And also, if you want a further grounding, you could pick up one of the classic right libertarian economics guides, like Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell, Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt, or Economics for Real People by Gene Callahan. Now, astute listeners will have begun to realize that up until now, I haven't actually recommended a single full book by any of the famous original theorists of mutualism in the 19th century, specifically by Pierre-Joseph Proudhon or Benjamin Tucker. Well, starting with the case of Proudhon, I just don't think he's that good of a writer. I honestly think he's really bad. At least Marx has a little bit more of a fire in his soul when he writes, and Engels oftentimes even more so. Yes, Marx can be dry in some of the books, like Capital, where it would be basically impossible to present every inch of it in a very appealing and user-friendly way, but Proudhon seems to have the ability to turn anything boring. I mean, for fuck's sake, the man wrote an entire book called Solution of the Social Problem, which is just a bone-dry technical textbook of calculations and formulas and fucking actuarial tables and shit related to his proposal for mutual banks, which is something explained far more succinctly and clearly in Kevin Carson's Studies in Mutualist Political Economy, and even really just in Gary Elkin's Mutual Banking. And that's only 10 pages or so. Even Proudhon's most practical and grounded work about the actual practical functioning of an anarcho-socialist society, entitled General Idea of the Revolution in the 19th Century, is far and away inferior to something like Section I of an anarchist FAQ for similar content. Although there is one specific book by Proudhon that I do recommend, but only reluctantly, and I'll bring that up later. Benjamin Tucker, on the other hand, is certainly a better writer than Proudhon, and I would definitely recommend those essays by him that are featured in the Markets Not Capitalism anthology. To review, those are State Socialism and Anarchism, Armies That Overlap, Socialism What It Is, Does Competition Mean War, and Should Labor Be Paid or Not? It's a lot easier to find basically the complete works of Tucker online compared to Proudhon. For one, you don't have to deal with multiple translations, obviously, but also the works themselves are just easier to find. In fact, basically the complete works of Tucker have been anthologized since the early 20th century in just two books: Individual Liberty, compiled in 1926, and an anthology entitled Instead of a Book by a Man Too Busy to Write One, which is the more widely known one by a mile for sure. Instead of a Book is actually mostly made up of a series of letters to the editor from Tucker's anarchist periodical simply entitled Liberty, which was actually one of the most widely circulated anarchist periodicals in the country at the time, from 1881 to 1908, while Individual Liberty is made up of short essays from that magazine. This might seem at first glance to be pretty easy to absorb stuff, but in terms of instead of a book, for example, the entire thing is, at least according to the Anarchist Library, 734 pages long in total, and despite the fact that it is technically organized by topic in the table of contents, it doesn't really feel like it somehow. It still feels extremely haphazardly organized, and there's no real attempts to start with easier concepts first and then move on to more complicated stuff. So I wouldn't really recommend instead of a book unless you really like old school political theory. Individual Liberty could be better organized, although I haven't read it, but if you feel like tackling it anyway, go for it and let me know what you think. Continuing on with part 7, with some more fresh modern stuff, I'm dividing it up again based on whether you identify as an ANCAP or an ANCOM. For the ANCOMs, I think it's worthwhile diving into, if you're not already familiar, some sources detailing the operation of the Federal Reserve, and how artificially expanding the money supply too often debases the currency and leads to inflation and business cycles. Of course, from a socialist perspective, there are many other aspects of our current system that can contribute to business cycles, but there's no reason why the Austrian theory of the business cycle can't be combined with a socialist understanding. To that end, a lot of people might recommend one of Murray Rothbard's main works on the Fed, either The Case Against the Fed from 1994, or What Has Government Done to Our Money from 1963, and G. Edward Griffin's The Creature from Jekyll Island from 1994 did make a brief appearance in my previous video as one of the images in the slideshow, but I think a still yet more modern work might work better, so I would recommend, of all people, Ron Paul and his 2009 book *And the Fed*, as well as the significantly more vaguely titled YouTube documentary entitled The Collapse of the American Dream Explained, which covers a lot of the same concepts from a slightly more centrist to left-of-center populist perspective. For the ANCAPs, I think it's worthwhile to really more firmly establish the arguments in favor of workplace democracy, and to more deeply understand why we left anarchists have such a deep aversion to the way businesses are currently run, beyond simply what harmful actions businesses can take that affect the wider world outside of the office. Many people these days are vaguely familiar with the concept of anti-work due to the success of the eponymous subreddit, but it's worthwhile to remember that these ideas aren't just some broad, leftist, reactive, impulsive thing that appeared suddenly a few years ago, but that they originate specifically from the anarchist community and are informed by an anarchist view of the world. There's an enormous number of essays and longer works that fall under this category that have been collected by anarchist movements of today. The anti-work library at the eponymous subreddit provides you with far more leads than anyone could ever possibly hope to read, with a lot of great stuff. At least the books and essays above the situationist section of the reading list. Underneath that, though, it does start to veer off topic quite a bit. Ultimately, though, the most helpful place to start for supporters of capitalism would be to look at longer book-length works that really lay bare just how difficult it is to be a worker in current-day America. Works with lots of concrete examples based off of anecdotes and also statistics regarding the specific conditions of today. In comparison, a lot of the stuff on the anti-work library tends towards more philosophical, literary musings on work rather than things that would actually be convincing to people not already in our camp. For positive examples of actually convincing works, there's Nickeled and Dimed by Barbara Ehrenreich, which, while being flawed and in some cases outdated, is nevertheless still widely read and appreciated today by socialists of all kinds, especially since wages haven't really increased that much since 2001, when the book was first published. Ehrenreich herself holds up Linda Tirado's Hand to Mouth, Living in Bootstrap America, published in 2015, as a worthy successor to Nickel and Dimed that avoids some of the constraints of the original experiment. I also really enjoyed Work Won't Love You Back by Sarah Jaffe for those looking for something with slightly more millennial-tinged aura to it in terms of the specific struggles and anecdotes she focuses on. I would recommend any of those books personally, but the most helpful book in this regard, and the one I think you should read if you don't read any of the others in this section, is Private Government by Elizabeth Anderson. A great mix of historical background with a discussion of contemporary events and examples, and philosophical rigor. Elizabeth is a moral philosopher with a degree from Harvard and a position at the University of Michigan. Quick warning though, Elizabeth is not an anarchist, or really seemingly any type of socialist, definitely a social democrat. Her ideal solution is something like that of workers serving on the board of directors, like what is common in Germany. And she doesn't even remotely touch on the possibility of workers actually self-managing a firm from top to bottom, which is mind-blowing considering she must clearly be familiar with that idea, given her basically accurate overview of 19th and 18th century economic history in the first part of the book. Although she honestly pretty brazenly cherry-picks only certain aspects of that history to talk about, with very brief periodic references to Marx, and only a single paragraph quickly dismissing the relevance of anarchism, syndicalism, Georgism, and other ideologies which are critical to understand the idea of empowerment of workers in socialism and the mutually exclusive interests of the employer and employee. All of this blunt dismissal is in the service of focusing exclusively on the levelers of early modern England, not even the diggers who had pretty unequivocally a bigger impact, and Adam Smith, Thomas Paine, and Abraham Lincoln, of which only really Smith and to a lesser extent Paine are really important to modern-day socialists. Maybe since she's writing for an academic audience, she's overly paranoid about being accused of the one sin which academia cannot tolerate, that being choosing generalism over specialization. I must also include an aside about the most long-established and influential text in the anti-work sphere, Bob Black's The Abolition of Work from 1982. While it is a really good long essay and really inspiring, and I'm actually going to mirror a recording of it from a few years ago on this channel, it just doesn't really do the job for what I was looking for this section. It's very reflective and psychological and narrative-oriented, and because of that, for the most part, it's only really useful for people who are already convinced of the main ideas. But I had to bring it up because it's kind of omnipresent still when it comes to anti-work writings, as being the text that first crystallized these ideas for the modern anarchist movement. Although there are some older works that somewhat prefigure our modern conceptions of anti-work, as the Anti-Work Library does mention here and there. A decent companion to the anti-work books I do recommend, however, is What Do Bosses Do? The Origins and Functions of Hierarchy in Capitalist Production by Stephen Margolin. Samuel Konkin is another important author that probably falls more likely under the pseudo-mutualist camp than that of genuine mutualists. He's sort of a heterodox ANCAP known for being more critical of big business than his fellow ANCAPs in that framework, and he's most famous for pioneering the concept of agorism, which is basically promoting working under the table as a way to starve the state of revenue, as well as to build wealth at the expense of the state, and promote a sense of community and cohesion among anarchist activists all doing the same thing. I think that this strategy is interesting, but I think that agorism proponents in general overestimate its effectiveness in actually overthrowing the status quo. Nevertheless, he had an enormous impact on the development of anti-big business free market anarchist thought and the community surrounding such ideas in the late 90s and early 2000s, inspiring the mutualist revival of the late 2000s and early 2010s, and helping to move at least a small number of committed ANCAPs towards more explicitly anti-capitalist viewpoints, as exemplified by the writers associated with the ALL. The relevant texts here are an Agorist primer, an Agorist class theory by Wally Conger, which draws on some of Konkin's unfinished work before Konkin's untimely death in 2004. By the way, there is some retreading of old ground here when it comes to discussions of anarcho-capitalist dispute resolution organizations, which was already covered in much greater depth in For a New Liberty and the Machinery of Freedom, but there's still plenty of other newer insights in both these texts as well. Going back in time a bit, I would recommend a famous essay by a precursor to both Marx and Proudhon that really laid out the full case for socialist exploitation theory from start to finish, Labor Defended Against the Claims of Capital, by the English theorist Thomas Hodgkin, published in 1825. Hodgkin is someone who is sometimes referred to as an anarchist, but I think really counts more under the small government advocate category. One thing in particular about this text, there is a version floating around the internet on a few different sites that says that it's 108 pages long. This is only because it was taken from a pocket version of the essay, I believe. So the actual text itself in normal font size is only a few pages. Technically, he did write a full book-length work in 1832, expanding on the positions talked about in that essay, entitled The Natural and Artificial Right of Property Contrasted, but I haven't read that, and it's hard to find any commentaries on it online. And the language is pretty archaic from what I've managed to glean, in comparison to the shorter essay. Next, I'm going to recommend an interesting author who was praised at many different points in an anarchist FAQ as an eloquent exponent of market socialism. David Schweikart is an American theorist who is not an anarchist. He believes in retaining government and welfare programs, but his vision of an economy dominated by worker co-ops and self-employed people is notably similar to mutualism. He's certainly fairly obscure unless you're a big fan of the Anarchist FAQ, and he has only written a small handful of books, of which only 2 are really relevant here: Against Capitalism from 1993 and After Capitalism from 2002. In my view, Schweikart is the kind of more reformist socialist that people like Richard Wolff and Bhaskar Sankara wish they were, and someone I think might be a fantastic introduction to socialism more broadly for prospective newbies. His prose is clear and his tone consistently optimistic, and he just might be someone whose influence will grow pretty substantially in the coming years, as long as there are people willing to drop his name in conversations in socialist circles as someone worth paying attention to. Let it not be said that I am too much of a Kevin Carson simp. Unfortunately, although he is a master of the essay format, and his first book is essential, I can't say the same for the other 5 books he's published since then. The books in question, which you'll see on your screen now, are really a set of long, meandering technical works which ostensibly all seem to revolve around a grab bag of various new developments in activism or technology relevant to mutualist goals, which you wouldn't think would be something that would be particularly difficult to understand, but it is, unfortunately. Organization theory, in particular, suffers from being too overly ambitious in the enormous amount of topics it's trying to cover, being really unable to dive deep into any one of them, despite the book being over 600 pages long. Part 4 is somewhat of a reprieve from this and a bright spot, but it really ends up just being a restatement of the best parts of studies in mutualist political economy. Wonky is another word I would use to describe his later works, requiring a lot of background knowledge of technical terms in economics and the hard sciences. If you want it to be charitable and positive, which there's no reason not to be, you reasonably could make the case that his explorations into alternative modes of living and obscure activist groups of the 21st century are just too ahead of their time in a sense. They require a lot of digging on obscure blogs to uncover more information. A lot of these activist groups don't really have full book-length manifestos to read, or articles from the press even so much. Many of his citations are actually from email lists and groups, not to say that the information from there is inherently spurious, just that it's hard for other people to follow up on in that case. And the more well-known theorists he does cite, like Ralph Borsodi and especially Lewis Mumford, are certainly not known for their brevity either. Most recently, I tried to get through Homebrew Industrial Revolution because it seemed, on the surface, to have a lot of interesting premises and arguments, but after weeks of slogging through just the first 130 pages out of 400 or so, I eventually gave up. I really would like to get into the other Kevin Carson books. I mean, they are sometimes referenced by other 21st century mutualist writers, but only occasionally, which I think is relevant. I mean, if you give them a shot and find them easy to digest, please do tell me what they're about. I may just be too damn dumb to figure it out. For the second to last section, I mentioned that there was one Proudhon book that I begrudgingly recommend. That would be Proudhon's What is Property, just because it's so heavily quoted from in anarchist spaces that it's basically impossible to avoid. Thankfully, it's pretty short, but it's very important to read to understand the personal versus private property distinction that the majority of left anarchists as well as Marxists hold to, even if I myself have serious problems with that distinction. Finally, after all that, the moment you've all been waiting for: strategy. What do we actually have to do to reach a free society in our lifetimes? How do we organize the disparate squabbling political factions of Western nations into politically revolutionary coalitions to actually overthrow the present system? On this question, I can offer no better recommendation than the works of Keith Preston, an American anarchist political commentator who's dedicated quite a lot of time to this question, and my favorite political writer. He manages a blog that's been continuously updated since 2001, entitled Attack the System, which, unlike a lot of the blogs that I've mentioned in this video, doubles as not only a repository for essays on abstract topics and strategy, but also as a news aggregator site, offering commentary on current events from a radical anarchist perspective. I mentioned Keith briefly near the beginning when I offered up a couple essays by him as representative of a summary of mutualist economics to get you started. However, Keith's primary insights revolve around his concepts of anarcho-pluralism and pan-secessionism, which seeks to expand a platform of unity and cooperation between different schools of anarchism into a platform of cooperation between all of the various ideological camps of modern-day America that have a gripe with the present system of centrist multinational corporatocracy, and to organize them into a large enough coalition to actually defeat the present order and replace it with a radically decentralized social order based off of radical consent, voluntary contract, and free association, philosophical principles that all anarchists hold to, regardless of how they think such a system ought to work in terms of specific proposals for politics, law, and economics. Another one of the most important themes, running through nearly all of his major essays, is a plea to attempt to divorce the broader left anarchist movement from its current-day obsession with focusing on broadly leftist social causes, like racial issues, feminism, and gay and transgender rights, to such an extent that it not only crowds out entirely the issues of economics and class, as is occasionally brought up by thoughtful leftists like Glenn Greenwald or Jimmy Dore, but also even issues of war and imperialism and opposition to the police and surveillance state domestically. This is the kind of thinking that for a good number of years, and still today, was called political correctness, which eventually morphed into social justice warriors, or SJWs, for about 5 or so years in the early 2010s, before eventually most of us, rightly or wrongly, settled on woke as the predominant term around 2016 or so. While an overly narrow focus on these kinds of polarizing culture war, trivial and frivolous topics is increasingly a problem in the ANCAP community, with many ANCAPs falling into reactive anti-leftist narratives, leading to a larger presence of social conservatism nowadays compared to what it was when I was first starting out. These people now often have a fixation on the conservative cause du jour, like the trans issue or Donald Trump. It simply can't hold a candle to its equivalent fanaticism on the left. This stuff also prevents any coalition building between left anarchists and ANCAPs, let alone coalition building between anarchists and non-anarchist factions. Unfortunately, when I set out to pick which one of Keith's 5 currently available print anthologies from Black House Publishing would best capture the essence of his ideas, I eventually unexpectedly came to realize that none of them would really do. I mean, for example, it was a good thing that I bought his first anthology, simply entitled Attack the System, when it first came out, because I didn't even realize that they had made 2 editions since then, and I have the first edition on my shelf, which seems a little better than the second edition according to my reading of their respective tables of contents, but that first edition has been kinda wiped from the internet, so you're kinda stuck with a second edition if you haven't bought it already. So, in light of all this, I've endeavored to create my own Attack the System anthology, which I have uploaded to Google Drive and put a link for in the description, right by the link to the ALL anthology, bringing together what I think are the best articles from Keith and other writers associated with Attack the System through the years. It is significantly more weighty of a tome than any of the commercially released anthologies as of yet, so I think you could be able to get away with just reading parts 1 and 2 that I've prepared if you want, which focus a lot more on the fundamental strategic ideas and an outline of the future libertarian order within the borders of the former United States. There are no articles included here whose main topic is economics, as I'm sure you are more than sick of economics by now. Although it's not completely devoid of economic proposals, a lot of the longer essays do briefly give an overview of economic ideas put forward by people like Rothbard or Kropotkin, which have already been covered by a lot of the authors on this list. Here is an overview of the rest of the different sections of the document. As I mentioned, a significant theme of Attack the System's ideas is the importance they place on critiquing the left from the left. And so, while Part 3 is a small collection of Keith's essays written to criticize the right, both socially and economically, the majority of the rest of the essays in this document are about political correctness, and the stranglehold it has over radicals in the West at present. So if you consider yourself a man or woman of the left, of course, I recommend you also read Parts 4 and 5, which are the sections which most strongly focus on those topics, alongside Parts 1 and 2. But if you're an ANCAP or conservative of some kind, you can probably skip Parts 4 and 5 since it's nothing you haven't heard already, and since the modern right tends to be less dogmatic about their viewpoints, which is a contention that Keith backs up with evidence in his essays, I wouldn't actually even necessarily consider it super critical for conservatives to absorb the critiques in Part 3, actually. As for the final parts, Parts 6, 7, and 8, well, you can kinda just pick and choose which articles are of greatest interest to you. Those are the less critical ones for sure, although I particularly recommend the third essay in Part 7 and the first, fourth, and fifth essays in Part 8. There are a good number of texts that I looked over in preparation for this video that didn't quite make the cut. These are either mutualist blogs or non-mutualist writers that, while influential on our community in the 21st century, weren't quite as influential as other non-mutualist authors like Marx, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Murray Rothbard, David Friedman, and so on and so forth. I first have to again mention the Center for a Stateless Society's website, c4ss.org, which rightly or wrongly has been the primary meeting place for mutualist writers since it came online in about 2012 or so, with over 2,000 articles at present. Most of the 21st century writers whose essays compose the Alliance for the Libertarian Left anthology and the Market's Not Capitalism anthology are represented there, and this is where you can find what they're up to today. I don't really keep up religiously with new posts on C4SS, as there is quite a lot of new content each week, and also I think I have a good enough understanding of mutualism to not need to always be up on the latest content, although Eric Fleischman's work in the past few years has caught my attention for sure. In terms of more specific recommendations for content on the C4SS website, I mean, it doesn't clearly lay out what essays from its authors you should read in the way that the Alliance for the Libertarian Left webpage and the Market's Not Capitalism anthology definitely does, but there is a zine library that they feature, which you'll see the link to on your screen, which seems like a decent way of exploring more recent mutualist writings from the later 2010s and 2020s, alongside the significant number of essays from the late 2000s and early 2010s that you've already read. This zine library is probably the best way forward, apart from just skimming through the recently uploaded articles or searching by author. You know, there's some other random stuff here, like PDF periodicals, which are really just re-uploads of articles you've probably already read, a Market Anarchy FAQ, which in my opinion is pretty incomplete, a decent amount of podcasts archived which tend towards the pretty obscure and inside baseball topics, in my opinion. Anyway, that's enough about C4SS. Good stuff, but not particularly well organized. Kevin Carson's blog, mutualist.blogspot.com, as I mentioned a while back, is reactivated, and you can go back and read it. I really would have no idea where to start, as I never read it avidly when I was younger, as I mentioned. Georgism, the philosophy of Henry George, also known today as Geoism, which believes in only taxing the value of land. There have always been a notable fringe movement of Georgist libertarians, small government Georgists, and also Georgist anarchists, actually, so that's why I thought I should mention it. In general, the Georgist anarchist, or geo-anarchist movement, has always found the biggest kinship with mutualists within the anarchist community. A lot of the more well-known geo-anarchist writers are friends with some of the biggest mutualist writers. I only mention it at this point because I really don't know where else to put it in this video. I really don't understand Georgism that well, however it has always stuck around as a distinct tendency within radical politics since the time of Henry George himself in the late 19th century. And there are lots of Georgist organizations, websites, forums, and so forth, If you're looking to understand Georgism from a mutualist perspective, from what I've managed to gather, the best places to do that would be to search for Georgism or Geoism on Kevin Carson's blog, again, mutualist.blogspot.com, and also C4SS, but that's as far as I can take you. As I said, I don't really understand Georgism that well. Next, some book-length works. I've divided up my optional book recommendations into categories based off of genres. I decided against including books covering topics such as the history of U.S. imperialism, the corporate media, and the police state, since if you're an anarchist watching this, you pretty much already know the score when it comes to stuff like that. And fair warning, I'm not really sure how this happened, but this list ended up being pretty heavy on both environmentalism and the early history of humanity for some reason. First up, historical works. ANCOMS in particular would probably really enjoy E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class, which was a major influence on Kevin Carson's narratives regarding the rise of capitalism in the enclosure movement of the 17th and 18th centuries in England. Gabriel Kolko's The Triumph of Conservatism is a refutation of the traditional liberal narrative on the progressive era of America at the turn of the 20th century, as being, rather than a triumph of an activist government against corporate tyranny, instead a case of corporate government collusion at the expense of working people. Surprisingly, this book has received quite an enthusiastic audience among right libertarians and ANCAPS since Rothbard recommended it so highly back in the day. If only more ANCAPs read leftist literature when it wasn't recommended by one of their own. And there is some information about the railroad companies of the Gilded Age, which the progressive policies were a direct response to. Kolko says in the introduction that the triumph of conservatism isn't primarily about railroads, but there is some interesting stuff on that as well, as I quoted from in the previous video. Men Against the State, The Expositors of Individualist Anarchism in America, 1827 to 1908, by James Martin, is an often overlooked historical study of many of the characters I analyze in this video, some of which I recommend reading, and some I think are derivative. David Beto's Mutual Aid and the Welfare State is the primary academic source for our understanding of the lodge medicine movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in America, which is a significant element in the contemporary mutualist community's conceptions of healthcare, and whose thesis I briefly summarize in my previous video. Distributism is a critical influence on the development of 21st century mutualism, which I briefly touched on in the previous video. It's basically equivalent to mutualism, except it doesn't believe the state should be abolished per se, although a lot of distributists, especially contemporary distributists, do hold to a relatively limited role for government. So distributism is a separate ideology that could nevertheless be considered like a cousin to mutualism. I haven't read a lot of distributist books all the way through, although I have read some articles, but according to its advocates, distributism is mostly based off of the work of the English writers G.K. Chesterton and Hilary Belloc, who sought to refine and improve upon the often forgotten body of work that goes under the name Catholic social teaching, which very few people, including most Catholics, are familiar with at all. However, Belloc and Chesterton saw a lot of value in it and wrote and argued in favor of it. Particularly, they were inspired by the papal encyclicals Rerum Novarum and Quadragesimo Anno by Popes Leo XIII and Pius XI, respectively. Other popular distributist writers include John Mackay, Christopher Ferrara, John Forrest Sharp, and Arthur Penty. There are also a couple good anthologies, The Hound of Distributism and Beyond Capitalism and Socialism, and certain distributist writers have been particularly influenced by anarchism, such as Dorothy Day, and Bill Kaufman, one of the best nonfiction prose stylists in America, in my opinion. It's reasonable that after reading all of this radical literature that talks about the adversarial relationship between the boss and the workers, between the average citizen and the government and large corporations colluding together to keep us all down, you might be interested in learning more about class. What classes are there? What is their relationship to one another? What roles does each class fill in modern culture? Well, I definitely think that Marx, Adam Smith, and Samuel Konkin are the most important fundamental theorists for you to get a handle on, but there are other widely read works as well. I think that everyone interested in politics should read Niccolò Machiavelli. If for no other reason, then a whole lot of our enemies in government and the big business world read Machiavelli and are inspired by his insights to achieve their own level of power and influence in society, in the spheres that they have chosen. The relevant work here, of course, is The Prince. Who Rules America by William Domhoff and The Power Elite by C. Wright Mills are both very influential mid-century works about the reality of American governmental power structures. Quick note about the former, though. There's been quite a number of updated versions and editions since the original, and some of them may not be as insightful or useful as the original, and I personally can only really vouch for the original edition from 1967. Robert Michels's work, Political Parties, a study of the oligarchical tendencies of modern democracy, is worth reading as well, but with a critical eye. While Michels may be reservedly in favor of authoritarian government, I think this work illustrates that anarchism is the only viable solution to the rise of oligarchy and elitist structures within nominally representative democracy. James Burnham, in particular, may be the most important writer about social class apart from Mark Smith and Konkin, and is particularly recommended to Marxists, as Burnham pioneered the clearly self-evident, but often maligned concept of the professional managerial class, known to the Eastern European writer Milovan Djilas as the new class, upwardly mobile white-collar professionals that affect liberal and progressive ideologies, but in reality are just another wing of the ruling class. Burnham makes clear to people that may be stuck in mainstream Marxist dogma or other such narratives that the West's modern ruling class has many different sectors and gradations that are not necessarily motivated by financial gain, as many think, but rather by the pursuit of power in and of itself. His best work is The Managerial Revolution, but I would also recommend The Suicide of the West. To round out my recommendations on class, I'll add Thomas Sowell's A Conflict of Visions and The Vision of the Anointed, the two seminal studies on political polarization and alienation, which are The Big Sort by Bill Bishop and Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam, and the contemporary classic of political psychology, The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. Some leftist works now. David Graeber, prior to his unfortunate death in 2020, was, with the possible exception of Noam Chomsky, perhaps the most influential 21st century anarchist. An archaeology professor at the London School of Economics, he was one of the most influential figures in the Occupy Wall Street movement, and wrote many influential works, the most famous being Fragments of an Anarchist Anthropology and Debt the First 5,000 Years, which expands on themes introduced in the first book to create a fascinating grand unified theory of human history from an ANCOM perspective, arguing that the roots of our current economic malaise stretch all the way back to the technological and economic innovations of the Neolithic era, and that anarcho-communism is the only way out of our current predicament. Debt is more widely read than Fragments of an Anarchist Anthropology, and more important than the former, but the former is still important. But also, a highly recommended sequel in the trilogy is The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity, co-authored with fellow archaeologist David Wengrow, which, despite being a New York Times bestseller, is not necessarily as widely read in anarchist circles as Debt for some reason. It expands on a lot of Dett's historical arguments, and offers some positive words for and also criticisms of the foundational arguments of Anarcho-Primitivism, which I'll get to later. Any of the three most widely lauded books by anarchist anthropologist James C. Scott are also worth checking out, those being Seeing Like a State, The Art of Not Being Governed, and the most recent of the three, Against the Grain, which has a lot of Graeber-esque insights about early human civilization in there as well. Naturally, of course, Peter Kropotkin's The Conquest of Bread also comes highly recommended if you haven't read it already. If I had to rank all of the prominent non-mutualist anarchist theorists of past generations, I think Kropotkin probably comes out on top, because I think he strikes a great balance between talking about the philosophical underpinnings of anarchism in a more abstract way with fiery emotional rhetoric, and a much more grounded practical approach throughout many of his writings. In comparison, Bakunin and Emma Goldman, while certainly good people and real anarchists for sure, do tend to fall way too much on the former end of just vague emotional appeals for anarchism rather than having that practical bent. Errico Malatesta, while he does suffer from a little bit of that style over substance aspect that Bakunin and Goldman suffer from, he's not nearly as bad as the other two, so I would definitely recommend picking up his works if you haven't already. But let's not dwell too much on the classical anarchists, as I think most people here are more than familiar with them enough already. I just wanted to include them as an aside for any ANCAPS listening that may be more curious about the more old-school texts associated with left anarchism. I originally planned to include one of the more popular recent books by the famous left anarchist collective CrimethInc from back in 2011, simply titled Work, Capitalism, Economics, and Resistance, as an essential text. I mean, after all, I did use the cover of that book as the thumbnail for my previous video, but after giving it another look, I realized that it didn't quite fit the category of text I was looking for in Part 7 of the main reading list. In particular, I was looking around for left anarchist texts criticizing the authoritarianism and alienation of the modern workplace, but eventually came to realize that Work was more of a critique of capitalism more broadly, and I already had plenty of that kind of thing, so I decided to downgrade Work to the optional reading section and use the texts that you see in the earlier section on alienation as part of the main video instead of Work. Finally, a more recent text has been released in about 2017, I believe, early 2017, by the prominent left anarchist of the 21st century, Peter Gelderloos, which also falls under the category of discussing early state formation, as the first 6 books on your screen do. However, I've only read a little bit of it, and I'm not quite sure if Peter has the same rigor that Graeber and James C. Scott do, so I'll have to get back to you on whether or not I think it's an essential read or not. Parecon, or Participatory Economics, is probably also worth looking into for further information on left anarchist economics. This is despite that the overall structure of the economic system does end up being more similar to Bakunin's anarcho-collectivism compared to the far more prevalent anarcho-communism or mutualism. There are debates and discussions between Parecon theorists and ANCOMS proving that Parecon is distinct from anarcho-communism, but Parecon is still anarchist. The 2 original founders of the ideology, Michael Albert and Robin Hahnel, do still identify as anarchists. The movement surrounding Parecon seems to have gone through 2 distinct publishing booms, with a decent amount of time in between. The first original period of activity was between roughly 1991 and 2005, where the 2 of them wrote, in ascending order of publication year, Looking Forward, Participatory Economics for the 21st Century, The Political Economy of Participatory Economics, Thinking Forward, Moving Forward, Parecon Life After Capitalism, and Economic Justice and Democracy. The second period of activity started in 2012, and has been more dominated by Robin Hahnel, who's published Of the People by the People, Democratic Economic Planning, and most recently in 2022, A Participatory Economy, alongside Michael Albert publishing Realizing Hope Life Beyond Capitalism in 2014, and No Bosses in 2021, and Robin Hahnel co-authoring Alternatives to Capitalism alongside influential leftist sociologist Eric Olin Wright in 2016. I haven't read any of these books, actually, but if we're going exclusively by popularity, Parecon Life After Capitalism from 2005 would be by far the book to go for, although it may only be the most popular because it's the only one that actually has the abbreviated word Parecon in the title. The ANCOM YouTuber named Anarch particularly recommends No Bosses, although I'm not sure how many other Parecon books he's read. Also important centers of activity for the Parecon movement include participatory-economy.org, participatory-economics.info, which seems a little better organized, and the original Parecon website, znetwork.org, originally called Z Communications, which combines Parecon resources with news aggregation. The concept of primitive communism, the idea that Paleolithic society was significantly more egalitarian than that of succeeding eras, both in its political structure and its moneyless economy, was an important pillar in the thought of Marx and Engels, showing up in such works as The German Ideology, and particularly in Engels's The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, which I think may just be the most influential text by Marx and Engels on the ideologies and priorities of modern Western leftists, beyond even the Manifesto or Capital. And somehow, beyond all reason, I have actually been vindicated in this crackpot idea since the publication, many years ago, of the YouTube video essay Stolen Anarchy, Playing Indian and the Roots of Collectivism, by the creator named Twin Rabbit. I certainly think that he highly overstates the centrality of Native American political thought in shaping 19th century and later socialism, but I mean, that's just kind of his brand. The entire channel is really about political philosophy from a Native American perspective, so I can't really expect any different, but still, great to see that I wasn't the only person to have caught on to the understated historical importance of Engels's 1884 work. Naturally, this means that ideas about primitive communism have managed to filter down into leftist thinking generally, particularly in anarcho-communist circles, and to a lesser extent mutualist ones. This means that the arguments against the current system popular in the community known as the anarcho-primitivists have had a larger influence on the rest of us than a lot of people want to admit. Such anti-technological arguments can be traced back not only through Marx and Engels, but Rousseau and even ancient Greek writers. David Graeber's Debt and the Dawn of Everything are actually, I think, the best introduction to these ideas. They outline a lot of basic arguments that ANCOMS put forward and illustrate their pros and cons. As you can imagine, Graeber, like me, didn't actually believe that we need to completely revert back to the Stone Age to get back some of the positive traits of pre-civilized society. I say it's important to read some criticisms of primitivist concepts first, before actually reading ANPRIM literature itself. That's because ANPRIMs often rely on much older sources, or very cherry-picked sources, or both for their understanding of both modern and historical hunter-gatherer societies. The most prominent thinker within the anarcho-primitivist milieu is John Zerzan. In general, he was the thinker that was most interested in bridging links between this anti-civilization primitive society advocacy and the anarchist movement generally. He tended to try and emphasize the ultimately egalitarian and direct democratic nature of small hunter-gatherer bands, expressed most eloquently in his essay Future Primitive from 1994. The basis for that essay is one by Marshall Salins and Richard Lee, entitled The Original Affluent Society from 1972, which can be found along with other illuminating works in the anthology entitled Stone Age Economics, and David Graeber actually studied under Marshall Salins at the University of Chicago. I would also recommend these following essays from Zerzan as well. Now, what about the counter-arguments? Well, I mentioned before, anarcho-primitivists tend to cherry-pick their sources and also rely on older sources. For a rundown on this, I can point you towards no better source than Ted Kaczynski, who knew Zerzan personally and wrote an essay directly responding to Future Primitive entitled The Truth About Primitive Life, a Critique of Anarcho-Primitivism. Kaczynski's writings and the topics he often chooses to focus on can sometimes be rather technical, particularly in his original manifesto, Industrial Society and Its Future, and so that's why I recommend starting first with Zerzan, but really everything Ted Kaczynski ever wrote is worth picking up, starting, in my opinion, with Technological Slavery. An anthology of his writings, which was published while he was in prison. Make sure to get the second edition. That includes the original manifesto, Industrial Society and Its Future, as well as The Truth About Primitive Life, and a number of other texts as well. A thorough reading of Technological Slavery, as well as a quick jaunt over to Kaczynski's Anarchist Library page, will have you more than well enough acquainted with this great man's thoughts and opinions, and there are only a small handful of articles on the Anarchist Library page that weren't included in the Technological Slavery anthology. For more criticism of primitivism, also check out the book War Before Civilization by Lawrence Keeley. Zerzan was really the primitivist author that had the rosiest view of modern and historical hunter-gatherer societies. A lot of other writers and activists in the primitivist movement don't spend so much time comparing their visions to those of those other societies, and don't necessarily claim that modern and historical hunter-gatherers were as fully egalitarian as Zerzan does, and so they base their primitivism in necessity, of the possibility of environmental and civilizational collapse, rather than on an irrational calculus of the superiority of primitive life over modern life. And so, a lot of primitivist writers don't even really bother calling themselves anarchists even anymore, for this reason. For more on this particular strand of primitivism, which, as I said, is really seemingly the majority opinion these days, look into Derek Jensen's magnum opus, Endgame, Volumes 1 and 2. and Deep Green Resistance, Strategy to Save the Planet, as well as the 2009 documentary Collapse, outlining similar environmental viewpoints focusing on the perspective of the theorist Michael Ruppert. Other primitivist works to check out include the scattered writings by the essayist Farrell Fawn, who has the alternate pen name of Wolfie Landstreicher, as well as the authors Kevin Tucker, John Moore, and Freddie Perlman. Now on to some thinkers who are more liberal than leftist, but nevertheless most of these influenced the 21st century mutualist community a good deal. Christopher Lasch is hard to pin down. He started out as a Marxist and adopted some conservative viewpoints later in life, but never lost his affection for certain more left-wing ideas. His three most eye-opening works, The True and Only Heaven, The Revolt of the Elites, and The Culture of Narcissism, cover a wide range of topics from his vaguely distributist economic ideas, to the professional managerial class, to the rise of widespread narcissism among the recently maturing baby boomer generation that's still relevant today. Anything by Ivan Ilyich is worth reading, particularly Deschooling Society from 1971, a critique of the mass education system which would become more highly refined by more explicitly libertarian thinkers like John Taylor Gatto, and Tools for Conviviality from 1973, a fascinating melange of liberal, libertarian, and environmentalist thought that's sort of been forgotten today, but had a pretty big impact on the remnants of the 60s counterculture at the time. And he's significantly easier to read than Christopher Lasch. Both E.F. Schumacher and Kirkpatrick Sale touch on very similar themes to Ivan Ilyich, mixing liberal, libertarian, and environmentalist ideas with a greater focus this time on decentralism and secession. Particularly Kirkpatrick Sale has always been widely read and loved by the mutualist community. If I remember correctly, Kevin Carson credits Sale with making him a leftist. I would recommend Small is Beautiful from the former and Human Scale Revisited from the latter. Thomas Naylor was the central figure in the now unfortunately dormant Vermont secession movement from the mid-90s to the early 2010s, and his book Downsizing America is worth picking up too if you can find it for a decent price. Ralph Borsodi, and especially Lewis Mumford, with his classic The Myth of the Machine and Technics and Civilization, are also widely read by mutualists, as well as Jacques Ellul's Technological Society, which had a particularly strong influence on the anarcho-primitivists. Civilization and Its Discontents by Sigmund Freud is one of the most underrated works of old-school political theory ever written, anticipating a huge number of liberal and left-wing talking points and lines of argument that are completely ubiquitous today, covering everything from the rise of technology to, naturally for Freud, the effects of repression of one's inner feelings. While short, at only 53 pages, it is quite technical, but worth it to get through, I think. And finally, for some fictional works that can provide a lot of insight into the stuff we're dealing with politically these days, if you haven't read them, 1984 by George Orwell and Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. And for a woman's perspective, Margot Percy's Woman on the Edge of Time. Very, very 70s for that last one, but interesting, funny, and sort of libertarian Marxist in its proposals. I think it's pretty important to also have an addendum where I go over some mutualist writings that aren't worth looking into, in comparison to the pretty extensive list of recommendations. None of these texts are outright filled with lies or enormous distortions and slander, and neither do any of them promote any authoritarian or pro-capitalist concepts and try to pass them off as mutualist. But most of these texts, nevertheless, have some combination of uninspiring, bland, or overly technical prose, or else are just too overly reliant on the insights of those writers I've recommended as being worthwhile, and that don't have enough unique insights of their own. First off, organization theory, homebrew industrial revolution, desktop regulatory state, Exodus, the general idea of the revolution in the 21st century, and the state theory and praxis, all by Kevin Carson, as I mentioned earlier. What is Mutualism, published in 1927 by the American writer Clarence Lee Swartz, is very widely distributed these days, but is just not up to the same level of quality as the 21st century writers I feature here. Same with J.B. Robertson's The Economics of Liberty from 1916, and Voluntary Socialism by Francis Tandy in 1896, both of which are just restatements of the work of Tucker and Proudhon. Charles A. Dana's longish essay Proudhon and his Bank of the People from 1896, while often recommended, is clearly inferior to more modern explanations of the mutual bank concept, like Gary Elkin's Mutual Banking or Kevin Carson's works. Josiah Warren was Proudhon's protege in America, and was a person who many people hold up as the first American anarchist, despite him never using the term to describe himself. His works are difficult to find online, and so I don't really have too much of an opinion on him. I have just recently learned that he was actually publishing before Proudhon, a periodical entitled The Peaceful Revolutionist, as early as 1823, although he doesn't seem to have gone so far as to explicitly advocate the abolition of the state in this early work, as he does later definitely, even though he never actually uses the term anarchism at any point, as I said. I've skimmed Warren's most widely read work, Equitable Commerce, from 1852, and it seems generally to be as dense as Proudhon often is, so I wouldn't recommend it for beginners. He's also rather confusingly associated with the leftist economic concept of labor notes. This concept has been normally advocated by tendencies farther left than mutualists, like the model of anarcho-collectivism favored by Bakunin, the Parecon movement, and at least ephemerally by Marx in his critique of the Gotha program. The idea of labor notes as a system of remuneration seems to be at odds with the very existence of currency wholesale, whether that currency happens to be centrally planned, as in the current system, or decentralized, as in the case of mutualism and anarcho-capitalism. So it seems that at certain points, Warren abandoned certain fundamental principles of mutualism before adopting them again later. In general, Warren's work seems to me to be disappointingly technical, unsuitable for beginners, and also far too derivative of Proudhon. Sean Wilbur, the owner of the Libertarian Labyrinth blog, is unfortunately not a good representative of the mutualist community. I may stand alone here, but I just find him to be extremely arrogant and closed-minded, and very negative to any viewpoints not his own, and very insecure. He has this undeniable fixation on exerting control and stewardship of the 21st century mutualist community on the internet that no other contemporary mutualist writer has. And so he sets himself up as the supreme authority and kind of forces his way into seemingly every mutualist website and board on the internet, and kind of dominates the conversations that other people initiate about the ideology with these long, elaborate, technical, multi-paragraph responses. His prose in these internet boards and on his blog is, to put it bluntly, incomprehensible. He was actually trained in the techniques of postmodern deconstructionism in the vein of thinkers like Lacan and Derrida at the University of Oregon, so there's your explanation there. Wilbur's also undoubtedly a Proudhonian purist, a real Proudhon simp at a different level compared to virtually every other modern writer I've mentioned. He's never really gotten over the greater influence that Tucker's viewpoints have had in the 21st century via the work of mostly Kevin Carson. He's the primary contributor to the main Mutualism Facebook group, as well as the main Mutualism subreddit, but he really earned his fame in our community by being the first person to translate a lot of 19th century anarchist works from French, which is genuinely a very good thing. But I think that was a factor in establishing his Proudhonian purist fixation, and particularly a fixation on Proudhon's metaphysics, which I would argue are completely separate and really unnecessary to understanding mutualism, which is first and foremost an economic and political theory. If you ever come across the word mutuality in the original sources, or in commentaries on Proudhon online, or discussions of the definition of reciprocity, that's when you know you've hit the metaphysical stuff. Only someone as deeply invested in combing over every word of these dead European guys, as Sean Wilbur is, would be able to convince himself that Proudhon's half-baked metaphysical ramblings spread over his many books and essays would be worth something to the average worker in capitalism today. But that's where we are. Wilbur did translate a lot of stuff, which is a tremendous achievement in and of itself, and his translations of Bakunin are particularly welcome, given that Bakunin was a far better writer than Proudhon was. So if you really do like 19th century anarchists and their prose, and discovering continually more and more obscure anarchist writers is your bag, as that's what a lot of the blog consists of, is digging up texts from hardly ever before seen anarchist writers, then go ahead and take a look at his Libertarian Labyrinth blog, I guess. I've already talked about how I've certainly controversially chosen to not recommend any works by Proudhon, with the exception of his first book, What is Property, since that does explain, through unfortunately dense prose, the case for the abolition of private property based off of the definitions that he uses. Now, my main contention with that is that I prefer a different definition of private property and property in general, so allow me to sort of reiterate the arguments that I made near the end of my previous video, for clarity's sake. He, Proudhon, insists on defining property as being synonymous with the concept of the means of production specifically, whereas I prefer a more straightforward colloquial definition of property, as a thing that a specific person or small group of people have the exclusive right to use and dispose of as they see fit, according to the legal system in your local area, or else some philosophical abstract theory of property. So that's the great confusion that I think Proudhon's definitions have wrought. Proudhon also constantly refers to private property as simply property, which I think is ludicrous. If you're going to try and tackle Proudhon's work, however, I would recommend trying to find commentaries on his work written by Ian MacKaye, the main contributor to an anarchist FAQ, a significant number of which can be found at the Anarchist Library website. You can find the commentaries I'm talking about under his real name, Ian MacKaye, as well as under the pen name Anarcho. And I did explain a while back my reservations with recommending Benjamin Tucker as well, except for these specific articles included in the Markets Not Capitalism anthology. Finally, there are two writers in particular who have kind of okay prose a lot of the time, but just not consistently readable enough to recommend unreservedly: William B. Greene and Dyer Lum. Greene, of course, as I mentioned in my previous video, wrote a book on mutual banking, a topic which I think gets a better treatment in Gary Elkin's essay Mutual Banking and in Studies in Mutualist Political Economy. Dyer Lum is a little better, but in comparison to Greene, who is just unnecessarily dense, Lum falls under the category of being too derivative of Tucker in particular. But there is one particular essay by Dyer Lum that was included in the Markets Not Capitalism anthology, which I'm not a particularly big fan of, but it's pretty short, and, Charles and Gary thought it was a good idea to include it, so I guess, I'll take their word for it. Vulture and Declare is a difficult one, because I would definitely say that you should read her. I'm not putting her up on screen on the list of authors not to read, but I'm just not that familiar with her, despite having a much more favorable opinion of what little I've read, in comparison to all that I've read from Greene, Lum, Warren, and Proudhon. So I definitely recommend that you seek her out. I just can't personally vouch for any specific books or essays. And that's it. Honestly, don't take the optional section here too seriously and worry that you might be missing out if you don't read everything, or even anything at all from here, really. That was mostly me just freely nerding out about every single book that I could think of that has themes even remotely related to mutualism. And that's it. Stay safe out there, everybody, and long live the revolution.